Good afternoon, and thank you for joining JINSA for another webinar. I'm Blaise Mishtal, JINSA's Vice President for Policy. And since it's that time of year to talk Turkey, I'm delighted to be joined by JINSA Distinguished Scholar and former Ambassador to Ankara, Eric Edelman, and Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress and member of JINSA's Eastern Mediterranean Policy Project, Alan Makovsky. Both of whom I think know more about Turkey or have possibly even forgotten more about Turkey than anyone else in DC knows. And so very delighted to have them with us to discuss some recent ongoing developments in Turkish foreign policy, particularly as it relates to Israel. And we've seen sort of a lot of moves even in the last week, most notably the rumors or the suggestions that Hamas's political leadership had decamped from Doha, had left Qatar, and made its way to Turkey. I'm not sure. Let me start with you, Ambassador Edelman. Do we know for sure whether they are there, whether they've been invited to be there by Turkey? What is the status of this Hamas-Turkey relationship right now?
Well, I don't think we know yet in detail, whether they're there, whether they've been invited. It would not be totally surprising. I mean, they have, well, first of all, let me back up one step, which is to say the political leadership of Hamas has been, decimated by the Israeli campaign post-October 7th. So the entire senior leadership that was internal to Hamas in Gaza has been killed. And of course, Ismail Haniyeh was killed in Tehran. So the leadership has been, reduced in number. It's clear that the Qataris have sort of had a bit of a problem with the Hamas leadership with regard to the ceasefire negotiations that Qatar has been mediating, and has made it clear they would prefer them not to remain in Qatar. It stands to reason that Istanbul would be a place that they might go, having been there before. There's been a long-standing dalliance between the AKP government and Hamas, going back to, Alan will remember precisely, but I think going back to around 2006 when Khalid Mishal was invited to come and have consultations with the government. The U.S. government has, as I understand it, warned Ankara against hosting Hamas in the current circumstance, particularly given the reticence Hamas has shown to release the hostages, and including American hostages who are being held, and to agree to the ceasefire. And so, this is a moment of potential additional tension in U.S.-Turkish relations, which is also beset, as you know, Blaise, with many other tensions as well.
Thanks, Ambassador. Alan, since Ambassador Edelman mentioned it, maybe you could give us sort of a brief rundown of the history of Turkish-Hamas relations and why Turkey, or at least this government in particular, might be willing to host them.
Yeah, look, as the ambassador said, the relationship goes back to February '06 when Khalid Mashal showed up in Ankara, to everyone's surprise at the time. But the relationship has grown steadily over the years. Saleh Haruri, who was assassinated by Israel in Lebanon last December, but he was resident in Turkey for a number of years, was accused of planning operations from Turkey in the West Bank and against Palestinian Authority figures and against Israel. And Erdogan has made clear over the years that he does not consider Hamas a terrorist group. He has said they are a resistance group, and has gone so far, stunningly, I think, in a Turkish context, to say that they are no different than the national forces under Ataturk. that liberated Turkey at the end of and founded the modern Republic of Turkey at the end of World War I. So he is openly a big supporter of Hamas. And I just wanted to add something though about the more recent developments, if I could. I think when the State Department called Turkey out last week, the State Department spokesman, Matthew Miller, was not really asked about whether Hamas had moved to Turkey. He was being asked about Qatar. He volunteered that he had seen reports that they were moving to Turkey. And he said he is not in a position to dispute those reports. And he went on to warn Turkey against allowing Hamas to, as he put it, to live comfortably in Turkey. He said there can be no more business as usual with Hamas. And Turkey has to be clear on that. And he actually went further and said that to the extent there are members, and I'm quoting here, to the extent there are members of Hamas in Turkey or in any country, a number of them have U.S. blood on their hands, are under U.S. indictment, and they should be turned over to the United States. That, to my knowledge, and maybe if the ambassador or you, if you want to correct me, by all means, to my knowledge, it is the first time that the Biden administration has criticized Turkey's relations with Hamas. It's overdue. But I think it was a significant step and is likely to mark the beginning of a spillover of the Hamas issue into U.S.-Turkish relations. The Biden administration has now raised it, and of course, we'll see what the Trump administration does, but based on the appointments we've heard announced so far, Rubio, Waltz, and the like, people who are very pro-Israel, but critical of critical of Turkey, and specifically critical regarding Hamas, this issue of Turkish-Hamas relations is likely to remain an issue in U.S.-Turkish relations.
Yeah, I agree, Blaise, with everything that Alan just said. I think it's worth adding here, and Alan may want to comment, that it ought not be a total surprise that there is this affinity between between Erdogan, particularly personally, but the AKP and Hamas. I mean, Hamas, of course, has its roots in the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, and the AKP, is an offshoot of the Naqshbandi Tarakats, which also had, relations with the Brotherhood. And in some sense, this development in 2006 with Khalid Mashal pitching up in Istanbul was the precursor of what we would see evolve later in Turkish foreign policy at the time of the so-called Arab Spring, when Turkey developed a policy of essentially supporting Muslim Brotherhood, offshoots in Egypt, in Syria, in the Gulf, and it became a big bone of contention between Turkey and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia on the one hand, and the United Arab Emirates, vis-a-vis their relationship with Qatar, also was a sponsor of Brotherhood-related groups. So, none of this should come as a surprise, and it's born of, I think, a deep ideological affinity.
Alan, just to pick up sort of the flip side of this, which is, you talked about how it's impacting U.S. views of Turkey and potentially U.S. policy towards Turkey. How is this affecting the relationship with Israel So a couple of data points. You wrote for us a paper a little over a year and a half ago in March of 2022, when Turkey and Israel restored diplomatic relations after a long fallout, and President Herzog went on, I think it was the first visit in 15 years, something along those lines, of an Israeli president to Turkey. And you wrote at the time that this was, generally a good trend, but that the Turkish support for Hamas could become a sticking point if it wasn't resolved. And I think time for you, but showed that you were right. But clearly, Israel at the time was somewhat willing to overlook that Turkey hadn't completely cut ties with Hamas, was still allowing Hamas members to come in and out of Turkey, at the very least, travel on Turkish passports. And Israel is willing to overlook that. Is that something that they're still willing to overlook? Maybe is it convenient for Israel to have Hamas leaders in Turkey, where they might be more easily accessible, let's say, than if they ended up in Iran? I mean, after all, it was also this weekend, the same time that we were hearing that Hamas might be in Turkey, that Ronan Bar, the head of Shin Bet, traveled to Turkey to meet with his counterpart, supposedly to talk about a ceasefire with Hamas. So does this put Turkey in some sort of a better position to negotiate, to help Israel bring this conflict to an end?
Yeah, it should be. I think there's certainly a school of thought, and it's been around for a while in Israel, that it's potentially useful for Israel that Turkey has a relationship with Hamas within limits. I think it is worth noting that on the Ronan Bar, the head of Shin Bet, on his visit, that the report suggested that after the reports subsequently suggested that Turkey said it did not want to be a mediator between Israel and Hamas, which reminded me that I'm not aware of one instance, and perhaps there was something that happened behind the scenes, or perhaps my memory is faulty, but I'm not aware of one instance where Turkey was able to bring its influence to bear on Hamas. After the first visit of Khalid Mashal, I was working on Capitol Hill at that time for the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and it so happened I was in Turkey about 6 months later, and I met with the head of the National Security Council in Turkey, and I asked him, what is this visit from Hamas all about? He said, we intend to use our relationship with Hamas to change Hamas, to get them to accept a two-state solution and renounce violence and accept the previous agreements that Israel and the PLO struck. Clearly, none of that has ever happened. I've never heard Turkey even publicly call for that. And I haven't seen any evidence of influence by Turkey on Hamas. However, there certainly are those in Israel who think that it is potentially valuable. Turkey is a legitimate interlocutor for Israel, whereas Hamas isn't. And it's a way for Israel to pass messages. Well, okay, I'll leave it at that.
If I could just add, Blaise, and I'd be very interested in Alan's, view of this. Even before the Mashal visit, you could see, the affinity that Erdogan had for Hamas. I believe it was June of 2004 when I was ambassador, and Israel assassinated Sheikh Yassin, who was the then head of Hamas, which led to an enormous outburst of anti-Israeli sentiment by Erdogan and by the government. And we've seen those bursts, periodically. I mean, including when he was at Davos with Shimon Peres and other Israeli leaders. And we've seen it, since October 7th, repeatedly by Erdogan. in which he's accused Israel of committing genocide and said that Turkey will support the South African case at the ICC, calling for, or in, I guess, the ICJ, calling for Israel to be genocide, etc. So there's a long history of this. It's a deep affinity. I agree with Alan that anyone who thinks that Turkey is going to have a moderating influence on Hamas has the burden of proof on them to show that there's ever been a scintilla of evidence that that is the case.
And so, what is the status of Turkish-Israeli relations right now? Because also in the last week, we had Erdogan announced that he was going to sever relations with Israel. You had Turkey deny Israeli President Herzog access to Turkish airspace as he was trying to fly to Baku for the COP29 for the climate change summit. Are these just sort of Erdogan's usual rhetorical flourishes? Is the Turkish-Israeli relationship really heading back to where it was sort of in the post-Mavi Marmara phase, where it's a complete breakdown and fallout? Where is that relationship going?
Yeah,
Alan, any thoughts?
Yeah, he said he was severing ties with Israel, and he said this will be the policy in the future too. It was a very dramatic statement because although, and we haven't mentioned it, and perhaps some in the audience know that Turkey has actually declared a trade embargo already on Israel, which has been spottily enforced, but nevertheless has cut deeply into trade. But that was announced as something temporary, only until a ceasefire in Gaza. This time he said, I'm severing relations and it will continue into the future. However, and I checked on this as recently as a couple of hours ago with someone in the Turkish government who's in a position to know, the Turkish mission in Tel Aviv is still operating. And as far as I'm aware, the Israeli diplomatic mission in Ankara is still operating. So it's hard to know. Look, I think whatever Erdogan does on this, he's going to look at it most likely through the lens of his future relationship with Trump. And if he decides, let me back up for a moment. I think domestic politics would probably augur that he will cut relations, but he may well decide that for the sake of his future relationship with the United States, and particularly with President Trump, that it's better to leave well enough alone. One thing we can be certain, nobody in the Turkish media is going to go after him and say, what happened? You said we were going to sever relations and it hasn't happened yet. So I don't think he has to worry too much about media criticism if he doesn't follow through with his threat. But the threat is still hanging out there, just not acted on yet.
Yeah. Ambassador, thoughts on the direction the Israeli-Turkish relationship might go?
I largely agree with Alan. I think domestic politics, this is very popular right now in Turkey. The images on Turkish television are providing a fairly one-sided, I would say, view of the conflict, not just in Gaza but in Lebanon as well. So he also is contemplating how he manages the making himself de facto president for life because he's term limited under the Constitution. But I think in Turkey, I would say that's more of a suggestion than it is a impediment to his staying in office, or whether he figures out some other mechanism where one of his sons-in-law becomes his successor, or something along that line. But this is all very helpful to him politically. Particularly in a time where, despite some pretty energetic efforts by the central bank to undo the damage he's done economically over the last decade, inflation remains, persistently high, and the economy remains in, some difficulty. So this kind of thing, plays well, at home. But I very much agree with Alan. There was, if there wasn't a prohibition on alcohol, there would have been champagne corks popping, at the enormous presidential palace in Ankara on the night of the U.S. presidential election, or perhaps in Istanbul, where more likely Erdogan was, because the Erdogan family had established, a pretty close relationship with the Trump family, essentially connection between Jared Kushner and Erdogan's son-in-law. Kushners don't appear to be playing as big a role in this go round in the Trump administration, although I understand that Jared Kushner remains somewhat influential indirectly. But the initial view in the Erdogan camp was this was a good thing for Erdogan and for U.S.-Turkish relations. They have aspirations to get back into the F-35 program. They want to make sure the F-16 sale proceeds and goes through. So he will be, to some degree, conditioning how he looks at the Israeli relationship on the U.S. relationship and his personal relationship with Trump. And the Hamas thing could become an issue here that he has to take into account, as well as the relationship with Israel.
Yeah. In some ways, I find it striking that over the years, the U.S. government, really virtually every administration, has kind of ignored the Hamas issue in bilateral relations. I think Pompeo made a statement about it just before leaving office, when Trump was anyway distracted trying to focus on changing the result of the 2020 election. But otherwise, I really don't find any statements that we have made over the years criticizing Turkey's relationship with Hamas. And of course, Erdogan's rhetoric on Israel has really grown more extreme in recent months. He's accused Israel of wanting to invade Turkey. He has also threatened to invade Israel. He said, we could enter just like we entered in Nagorno-Karabakh in Libya. He also called upon the General Assembly to consider military action against Israel. So, his statements have become more and more extreme, and the U.S. more or less, well, I would say more, has just kind of put it in a box and put that box on the shelf and not commented. And so that was why I was really struck by Miller's statement the other day. Now, just add that, so the following day after the State Department spokesman's statements, we did sanction 3 Hamas fundraisers, quote unquote, living in Turkey. But I also noticed Blinken met with the Turkish foreign minister, Fidan, at a G20 meeting in Rio de Janeiro, I guess it was, that next day. Also, they issued kind of a routine statement about their meeting, and regarding Israel, they said as well, they look forward to the war ending and the hostages being released and humanitarian aid being increased, but they didn't. There was nothing about the Hamas issue. So I don't know if this will become something that we regularly hit on or not. The secretary didn't pick up on it. I don't know. Eric, maybe you have some thoughts on that, why the spokesman mentioned it, but it didn't seem to rise to secretarial level. But
I suspect that Secretary Blinken had a lot on his plate at the G20. We should bear in mind that the United States has a lot of other issues on the burner with Turkey, including Ukraine, the potential that Turkey could play a mediating role there, which is not, you know, inconsequential to the administration, as well as Syria, Libya. You mentioned already, Alan. I mean, there are a number of Nagorno-Karabakh and you know, Armenia, Azerbaijan. I mean, they've got a lot of business to do. So
No doubt.
it doesn't altogether surprise me that it didn't make it onto the, you know, the secretary's agenda, particularly since the spokesman's comments were so striking, as you point out.
So I want to come back to U.S. policy and the next administration in a bit. But Alan, picking up on something you said, you know, it certainly does seem striking that Erdogan seems at his most sincere when he's talking about Israel. And, you know, in addition to the list of recent statements, the one that stands out in my mind is so 2019 when he turned the Hagia Sophia into a mosque, and he said sort of next we'll liberate Jerusalem, which was also a pretty striking statement. But it, you know, to sort of the sources of Turkish or Erdogan's conduct, it seems that we had during the last administration sort of a bit of a respite from the more pugnacious, aggressive, assertive, out there foreign policy of Erdogan's government, right after being involved in the Libyan war and the Nagorno-Karabakh and in a bigger way in Syria. It seems that sort of around 2021, 2022, things quieted down, which I largely understood to be driven by the economic issues that you raised, Ambassador Edelman. You know, the high inflation. He was trying to get, if not Western countries, then Arab countries to give him an economic lifeline ahead of elections, and that really required him to sort of play nice regionally. So is Mr. Nice Guy over? Are we back to the more aggressive Mr. Erdogan? Or is what we're seeing sort of with Hamas and the tough talk on Israel just sort of directed at Israel and not necessarily going to manifest in other ways? What do you make of where Turkish foreign policy is going now?
I personally, I think much more the latter. I mean, he has continued to try to keep things calm, certainly with the Middle Eastern states you mentioned, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, with which he had been at loggerheads, and during, as you said, in 2021, 22, achieved rapprochement with them. And some of those relationships, particularly with Saudi Arabia, trade is really taking off, and there may be some co-production involved on the TB2 armed drones that Turkey is producing. So, and regarding Greece,
company run by his son-in-law, by the way.
A company run by his son-in-law, indeed. And on Greece, they've had a series of talks to try to keep things calm. But on Israel and Palestine, I don't see any let-up whatsoever. And although I was probably remiss not to mention this in response to one of your earlier questions, Eric talked about the economy. Of course, in the March elections of this year, the local elections, Erdogan, for the first time, his party came in second overall in the elections. The secular opposition won more mayorships, won more votes by any criterion. They won the election. And one of the things that hurt him was a religious party to his right, which took roughly 6% of the vote. And that party hit Erdogan hard, not only about the economy, that was certainly one of their key issues, but the other was Israel-Palestine. And they've kept up that drumbeat. And it was after losing those elections that Erdogan really has started taking the most extreme positions on Israel, the trade embargo, and some of the strongest anti-Israel, pro-Hamas rhetoric, trying to keep his base in line.
Yeah,
So not to delve too much into domestic politics, but at the same time that you're saying that he might be trying to appease sort of the religious right, uh, Alan, he's also been making overtures to the Kurds and potentially dumping his nationalist partners. What's going on there, Ambassador, or how are we to understand his I guess return to trying to hurt the Kurds?
look, this is not new. He tried this a decade ago. It didn't work out, and he uh, because of some of the domestic headwinds he was facing then. You'll recall a election in, I think it was 2015, which resulted in a hung parliament. He's been engaged in this kind of political gamesmanship for a long time, always with the same objective, which is to preserve, his leading role in the nation and his party's leading role in the nation, despite the ups and downs that Alan was describing. I mean, I think part of, you were asking earlier, Blaze, about his Turkish foreign policy, which is his foreign policy. I mean, there is no Turkish foreign policy that is not personally Erdogan's policy. Hakan Fidan, the foreign minister, former intelligence chief, is not an independent actor, heading a foreign policy, for instance, the way Abdullah Gül might have been when he was foreign minister, and more of a not an equal but a peer of Erdogan's. Ibrahim Kalin, the new intelligence chief, is a Erdogan staff guy, essentially, a factotum. So the foreign policy he's carved out for himself is, I think, a very ambitious one, that seeks to play a very large role, not just in the immediate region, which you can see playing out in Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenia, Azerbaijan, and also obviously in Syria. But beyond that, you see it in the Gulf, as Alan was saying. You see it in the Red Sea, where Erdogan has taken some initiatives, with regard to Ethiopia, Eritrea, that whole a set of conflicts on the southern part of the Red Sea region. You see it in Libya, and you see it very much in Ukraine, where he has played a mediating role with Russia, including a mediating role that got Paul Whelan and Evan Gershkovich and other Americans held, under totally specious charges in Russia, freed as part of a prisoner swap that the Biden administration orchestrated, but with a significant Turkish role as an intermediary. And he's continued to hold out the prospect of being a mediator in the Ukraine war with Russia. I mean, they have played a role in certain prisoner exchanges between Russia and Ukraine. And I think the Biden administration certainly has, wanted to keep that, possibility open as a way out of the war in Ukraine. And so Erdogan has, had to play this very complicated game with Putin, for instance, because he's on the opposite side of Putin in several of these conflicts, whether it's Libya, Syria, Nagorno-Karabakh, Ukraine even. But he needs to maintain, a certain, balance in his relationship. So it's really a balancing act that he's engaged in order to cut this, larger swath through international society, which, by the way, he also thinks redounds to his domestic political benefit.
Just staying with Turkish foreign policy for one more moment, Alan, since you mentioned it briefly, I wondered if you could maybe expound a little more on how you see Turkey's relations in the East Med, particularly with Greece and Cyprus, maybe unfolding in the coming months. In particular, because I know we have some of our Greek and Cypriot friends tuned in, so I'm sure they'll be curious to get your views on that.
Sure. Let me just add first one point on the Kurds. I have to admit, I'm pretty much a skeptic. I don't think the Kurds will really trust Erdogan again after the failure of the last initiative, 2011 to 2013 or to 2015, depending on how you date it. But it should be noted that even while there was this seeming gesture of his coalition partner suggesting that if the PKK surrendered, their leader could be released from prison, and even addressed the Turkish parliament, which was seen as a gesture anyway. I'm not sure all Kurds saw it as such a great gesture, but even as that was going on, Turkey removed 3 elected Kurdish mayors from their positions by fiat. That's something they've done quite regularly over the past several years, removing elected Kurdish mayors. And so this was kind of not so much an initiative that was all initiative. It was kind of giving on the one hand and taking with the other. On Greece and Cyprus, if I haven't used up all my airtime talking about Kurds. There's been a series of foreign minister meetings going on between Turkey and Greece. I think they've just had a 5th round. I think things are quite calm. It's the overall atmosphere. Both sides are trying to project something close to stability and normality. There was an incident, however, earlier this month where, and let me back up, that among the long-term plans in the Eastern Mediterranean is an undersea interconnector cable that would allow for electricity sharing between Greece and Cyprus, and eventually to go on to Israel. It falls into an area that is part of the expansive Turkish claims in the Mediterranean. Turkey earlier this month saw an Italian ship there, which they thought might be involved in starting to lay the groundwork or the seawork for this interconnector cable, and chased it away, made efforts to chase it away. So I think for right now, things are relatively calm. But as Greece and Cyprus proceed with their plans, I think there is certainly a warning sign. There's no sign that Turkey is backing off its vast territorial and economic exclusive zone claims in the Mediterranean. And well, I think I've probably said enough. I'd be happy to say a few words on Cyprus.
Well, Alan, I think you would agree that this period of calm that we're talking about was preceded by a period of tension that was completely stirred up by Erdogan himself.
Absolutely.
Threatening to, come to Greece in the middle of the night and attack Greece. I mean, it was completely contrived, in my view, for domestic political purposes. There was no kind of real basis for, there was all sorts of contrived, excuses for why he was doing this, but there was no real basis for it. And part of the calming effort was related to the desire of Turkey to purchase more modern F-16s, wake of being excluded from the F-35 program because of their purchase of the Russian air defense systems that had made them ineligible essentially for participation in the F-35 program. So there were a whole set of reasons that led to this calm, which followed a period of tension that was completely created.
Yeah, I think you put your sorry, go ahead.
And just to your point, it could blow up anytime he thinks it's useful for domestic
Yeah.
political purposes.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you put your finger on the critical point about the F-16s, because that was a very crucial purchase for Turkey. And the 40 F-16s and 80 upgrade kits. And because they are really starting to fall behind the Greeks in air power. And they have an aging F-16 fleet. Meanwhile, Greece is buying F-35s already. And there was an understanding, not explicitly stated as far as I'm aware, that this F-16 sale, although approved by Congress, would not proceed if there is any kind of aggression against Greece. And my understanding is actually something that had been a staple of Greek-Turkish relations, which was Turkish violations of Greek airspace, sometimes of its internationally recognized airspace, sometimes of its airspace that Greece claims 6 to 4 nautical miles beyond its internationally recognized airspace. But Turkey had been violating pretty consistently, and that has now stopped since the F-16 sale, at least according to my understanding. So yeah, I think that F-16 sale was very important, but exactly as you say, Ambassador, if Erdogan ever decides he wants to heat things up again, he'll do it. The Greeks, I think, have no interest in heating things up. They want things to be calm, but I think they also are serious about pursuing this undersea interconnector project, which Turkey will take exception to.
So
Yeah,
let
I mean,
me
it'll be
pivot.
interesting. I think it'll be interesting, Alan, to see with the departure of Senator Menendez, the former chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who was very staunch defender of Greece in this regard and a big critic of Turkey, but also Senator Ben Cardin, who was his successor. It'll be interesting to see whether the Turks think they, now get a pass, or not on this issue.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right that at the beginning, in the days immediately following the election, they thought the world looked pretty good to them, the US world. Erdogan had a good personal relationship with Trump, although it's sometimes forgotten that Trump actually put sanctions on Turkey 3 different times during his administration. So I sometimes think about Trump that he likes a strong man, but he wants strong men to recognize that he's the strongest man. And, one of his sets of sanctions on Turkey, I think, really sent Turkey into an economic tailspin that it has really not recovered from yet. But, among the appointments, particularly Rubio. Rubio is sometimes called the Republican Menendez. He was co-sponsor of the Eastern Med Act, which lifted the arms embargo on Cyprus. And he was certainly a strong encourager of the so-called 3+1 diplomatic initiative, the 3 being Greece, Cyprus, Israel, the +1 being the United States, which has fallen a bit into abeyance during the Biden administration. We'll see what the future holds, but the sense that Menendez's departure was going to lead to all good things for Turkey, I think at least has to be put on hold for now.
And Waltz has been very tough on Turkey as well.
And Waltz has been very tough on Turkey. Yeah. Yeah, it's not a great lineup for Turkey. I mean, going by the first term, I mean, we don't know how long these folks are going to be around. And, we know Trump can surprise his own people. And he certainly, in his first term, I think you may remember the details better than I do. He certainly raised eyebrows when he intervened with the Justice Department to try to get Halkbank, the Turkish state bank that is under prosecution in the United States for circumventing sanctions on Iran. He tried to get it off the hook at one point. He also delayed inordinately in imposing sanctions under CAATSA, prompted John Bolton, his former national security advisor, to suggest that he couldn't understand what motive Trump had in dealing with Turkey unless it was personal financial. At least he was widely reported to have said that, which was a strong statement. But, at least the lineup that we see right now, I don't think Erdogan should assume he's going to get a free ride.
Agree.
So you have both expertly preempted what was going to be my next question about how the Trump administration might see Turkey. Let me try to pose one more question and then open it up to our audience if they have any questions. I would invite you to submit them using the Q&A feature in Zoom. Type out your question and submit it, and I'll read it to our panelists. But gentlemen, you both talked about sort of the potential approaches that the Trump administration might have. But do you have a sense of what issues they might care most about, or what their priorities vis-a-vis Turkey might be? I mean, we've covered a wide range of issues, from the relationship with Israel to Russia and the Ukraine war to Middle East to East Med issues. What would a Trump administration expect from Turkey, or want to see from Turkish foreign policy? Ambassador, any thoughts?
It's a little hard to say because first, the team is not complete yet. I mean, we don't know who the sub cabinet and third level appointments will be, and those can have a very big impact on things like policy towards Turkey, which may not be on the front of this administration's agenda at the outset. I mean, I do think the Turks are going to press the issue of F-35. They want to get back in the F-35 program. To Alan's point, they see Greece procuring F-35. They may have noticed the degree to which the F-35 was employed very effectively by Israel a few weeks ago, and might quicken their interest in it. And that's going to be a very difficult challenge for the administration. Although President Trump, throughout his first term in office, with the encouragement of Lindsey Graham, was hopeful that he could actually strike some kind of deal over the Russian air defense systems. We had this problem with the S-300s in Cyprus back in the late 1990s, and it was solved by an agreement where these things were put into crates and stored on the island of Crete as a kind of compromise, which kind of unlocked what was really a kind of looming crisis in U.S., Greek, and Cypriot relations. I think Lindsey Graham has had in mind for some time some variant of that with the S-400 deal, we'll see whether something like that could possibly be tempting for Trump, who of course is always interested in transactional deals.
Alan, any sense of what Trump priorities vis-a-vis Turkey might be?
Well, I think I completely agree with Eric. I think particularly for Turkey, getting the F-35s, if not all the way back into the program, at least purchasing them, will be the top priority, and that will require clever diplomacy on the S-400s. Congress, I guess maybe not everyone in the audience knows, but Congress requires that Turkey give up possession of its Russian-produced S-400s as a condition for purchasing F-35s. That's from the Turkish point of view. Look, I do think, and this is very dangerous to speculate, as Yogi Berra said, predictions are very difficult, particularly when they're about the future. And I think maybe we could add maybe when they're particularly about Trump. But I do sense that the Hamas issue is going to play a role now in U.S.-Turkish relations. I mean, we'll have to see. One thing that occurs to me, and so out on a limb a bit, I'll go further. Trump, as we know, tried on 2 occasions, arguably 3 occasions, to withdraw U.S. troops from northeastern Syria, where they partner with the Kurdish YPG in fighting ISIS. We have about 900 troops plus a few contractors there. Turkey has been very critical of our relationship with the YPG, which it sees as part of the PKK, the Kurdish group, terrorist group that has been fighting Turkey since 1984. I could imagine some kind of effort made where at least discussed, where we would insist that Turkey end all ties with Hamas as among the conditions for our pulling out of northeast Syria. Now, if you ask me deep down, do I believe we're really going to leave Syria? I do find it hard to believe because I think we still need that presence there to keep ISIS under control. And I think it is an important means of our keeping an eye on what the Iranians are doing and trying to do in Syria. But I could see some kind of effort perhaps being made along those lines or discussed between Ankara and Washington.
Although it should be noted that the Biden administration has signed an agreement with Iraq that would see U.S. forces pull back from Baghdad and other areas of Iraq next year in 2025, just to the Kurdish areas, and then leave after 2026 altogether. And without that U.S. presence in Iraq, the U.S. presence in Syria becomes unsustainable, or at least much harder to sustain. So we very well might be on a glide path to leaving Syria.
I'd be interested in the ambassador's views of this. My sense is, I've seen a lot of reporting about our agreement with Iraq. There's still a bit of murkiness there. And according to some reports, we would be able to continue to sustain, even beyond 2026, our operation in northeast Syria if we were so inclined. I also do wonder, I mean, we're pretty well situated in Jordan, including near the Jordanian border at Tamf. Not sure we couldn't run the operation out of there, but of course it is much easier to run it out of Iraq. I don't know, Eric, do you think we could?
I was just going to say the same things you said, Alan, so I don't really have anything to add there. I do think that, pulling out of Syria, there'll be a pushback from folks who are worried about ISIS. And that is one thing that Trump tends to understand, which is potential downside domestic political consequences of, ISIS-related terrorism that might take place after a withdrawal like that.
Just maybe for a final question, pivoting back to this F-35 S-400 issue, because you've both identified that as potentially one transactional point for the relationship with the new administration. So my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that the current Turkish proposal on the table is to take the S-400 system, put it in crates, and store it at the Incirlik air base, the Turkish air base where the United States also has a presence and would have some sort of oversight, I guess, of the S-400 remaining in crates. Is that a good enough deal? Should the United States take that deal? And given, as Alan said, that Congress has legally required that Turkey no longer have in its possession the S-400, would that satisfy that legal requirement? Ambassador, any thoughts?
I defer to Alan on whether it would, satisfy the Congress. I'm not sure that it would. And I think it's a little bit hard to judge a deal like that in the abstract, because I think it also depends on the broader, trajectory of U.S.-Turkish relations. I mean, I would be loath at this point to agree to that, because we've seen too many, zigzags in Turkish policy over the years, including on Hamas, on Israel, and all the things we've been discussing. And I'm not sure we want to be in the position of selling F-35 to them, absent a better sense of, what the actual trajectory of Turkish policy is going to be. And part of selling them the F-35 is Turkey being, a part of the NATO alliance. And from my point of view, I think they need to act more like a NATO ally before we treat them like the ally that they are juridically, but have not been behaving as.
Alan, final thoughts on that?
I think, again, the ambassador put his finger on something very important. Look, from my understanding, that proposal, which has been reported along the lines you say, Blaise, is not satisfactory to our Defense Department. I do not think it would pass muster in Congress unless, as Eric says, the constellation of issues between the U.S. and Turkey fall into place in a certain way that make it more palatable. As of now, I don't think Congress would go for it. But Eric, I think, put his finger on what is really a bigger issue. Even if the S-400 requirement were met, even if Turkey destroyed the S-400s or found some other way to give up possession, I think given all the threats that have been made against Israel, as the ambassador mentioned, against Greece, in general, the aggressive policy that Turkey has pursued in the region, I think we do have to wonder whether the F-35s is a weapon we really want Turkey to have. So that's a bigger issue. But I suspect that it wouldn't be that easy to get that sale through Congress under any circumstances, S-400 or no.
All right. Well, Ambassador Edelman, yeah, sorry.
I was
Final
just
thoughts?
going to say, one other thing, which is the F-35 is a very, very sophisticated system. And I suspect any sale agreement that we reached with Turkey would be, the negotiations would be very, very difficult over a range of issues, including access to source code for some of the more sophisticated information systems on that aircraft. And so I'm not sure, even if you got Congress to agree and the administration agree to move forward, that you could actually reach agreement with Turkey that would allow them to feel that they had sovereign ability to operate the aircraft and also satisfy, the Department of Defense that a lot of the exquisite technology that's embedded in that aircraft is protected.
Well, Ambassador Edelman,
Blaise, could I just, one thing I forgot to address.
One sentence, Alan.
That you asked, and you mentioned that we have some interested people in the audience. I didn't want to totally ignore Cyprus, because there was a flurry of interest a few days ago when Erdogan held a rare informal meeting with the president of the Republic of Cyprus, which Turkey does not recognize. I don't think it really indicates that there's likely to be any forward movement on the Cyprus problem. However, I do suspect there is some concern in Ankara about the fact that U.S. relations with the Republic of Cyprus have been moving steadily forward. It's an interesting story. I won't say, don't worry, I won't go into detail now, but it was punctuated a couple of weeks ago by a visit, a previously unscheduled visit by the Republic,
Right.
by the President of the Republic of Cyprus, Christodoulides, to President Biden.
Right.
So thank
Right.
you. I didn't want to
Thank.
disappoint the audience that there's some followers of Cyprus. I also follow
Oh,
Cyprus
yeah.
closely. So
Alan, no audience is ever disappointed with you or with you, Ambassador Edelman. Thank you so much for lending your expertise. Erdogan always is sure to give us plenty more to talk about. So I look forward to having you on maybe in the new year to see how things develop. In the meantime, thank you to everyone who tuned in. I hope you enjoyed this discussion of Turkey. I hope you enjoy your digestion of Turkey in the next couple of days, and wish everyone the best. Thank you.
thank you very much.